AITA not ordering any food so I wouldn't have to split the bill. I've been part of this friend group since college, and our bond runs deep. There are about 8 of us, and we've shared countless memories and adventures together. From celebrating birthdays and navigating the trials of exams to parting our way through the ups and downs of early adulthood, we've seen it all. But like any group, there are a few who seem to make things more complicated than they need to be. In our case, those people are Susan and Greg. They have this uncanny ability to turn any fun outing into a financial nightmare for the rest of us. It all started back in our college days. We'd head out to grab a bite, everyone would order within reason, and then there'd be Susan and Greg. They'd pick the most expensive items on the menu, order extra drinks, and then, when the bill came, they'd suddenly have a financial crisis. "Oh, I forgot my wallet," Greg would say, or "Can someone spot me?" "I'm waiting for my paycheck," Susan would chime in. At first, we were sympathetic. We were all broke college students, after all. But as the years went on, their behavior didn't change. I remember one particular incident during a group trip to the beach. We decided to have a nice dinner at a seafood restaurant. Everyone ordered modestly, aware of our budgets. But not Susan and Greg. They ordered lobsters, cocktails, desserts, the works. When the bill came, they pulled the same old routine. This time, Greg claimed his card wasn't working, and Susan said she had an unexpected expense come up. We all ended up chipping in to cover their portion. It was frustrating, but we let it slide, thinking it was a one-time thing. But it wasn't. It never was. Over the years, these incidents piled up. There was the time at Sarah's birthday dinner when Greg ordered an expensive bottle of wine and then conveniently had to leave early, sticking us with the bill. Or the time at the new sushi place when Susan claimed she was short on cash after ordering enough food to feed an army. Each time, they had an excuse, and each time, we ended up paying more than our fair share. Last weekend, Dan, one of the guys from the group, told me about a casual dinner that was being planned. Now, Don's a good friend, and I usually enjoy these get-togethers, but I made it clear that if Susan or Greg were going to be there, I'd rather skip it. Dan, being the peacemaker he always is, tried to convince me to come, saying it would be good to put my differences aside just this once. Reluctantly, I agreed, but I had a plan. We all showed up at the restaurant, and, as expected, the conversation was lively. When it came time to order, everyone went around and picked their dishes. Most people chose meals that cost around $40, a reasonable amount for a nice dinner, but then it was Susan and Greg's turn. True to form, they went all out, each ordering dishes that cost around $200. They didn't even blink as they rattled off their selections, and I could feel my irritation rising. When it was my turn to order, I simply pointed to the $4 Miller Lite on the menu and sent the waiter away. Everyone looked at me, especially Dan, who asked why I wasn't ordering any food. I shrugged and said I had lost my appetite. 2 of our other friends followed suit, canceling their orders and opting for just drinks. The atmosphere grew tense, but I didn't care. I was done playing along with this charade. The main courses arrived, and I watched Susan and Greg dig into their lavish meals. I sipped my beer, feeling a small sense of satisfaction. When the check came, Greg, with his usual audacity, tried to split the bill 6 ways. I immediately corrected him, saying it should be split 3 ways since 3 of us hadn't ordered any food. Greg looked at me in disbelief, arguing that we always split the bill evenly. I reminded him that things were different this time because 3 of us only had drinks. The reality of the situation hit Dan hard. He was stuck with a $146.98 check, while his own meal had only cost around $50. I watched his jaw drop as he picked up the receipt. I slid a $10 bill towards the check to cover my drink, said my goodbyes, and walked out, leaving behind a storm of confused and angry faces. The next morning, my phone was blowing up with messages from Greg and Susan. They called me every name in the book, saying I was an asshole for not ordering food and making them pay more. I couldn't help but laugh. The irony was too rich. They were mad about paying more than they had accounted for, yet their extravagant orders were the reason for the high bill in the first place. Dan also sent me a barrage of texts, expressing his disappointment. He said I could have just not come instead of pulling that stunt and sticking him with such an outrageous bill. I felt a twinge of guilt because Dan is a good friend, but I also knew he needed to see the truth about Susan and Greg. They were using him, and it was time for him to open his eyes. Just to clarify, where I live, it's common for restaurants not to split checks, and drinks are often on a separate bill. And before anyone worries about the tip, this all happened in Australia, where tipping isn't as big of a deal as it is in the States. Over the next few days, I reflected on what had happened. Dan could easily have asked Greg and Susan to transfer him the money, but he's always been about helping them through their financial hardship, even though it's clear they're just taking advantage of his generosity. I admit my actions were immature and a bit petty, but I was tired of being forced to subsidize their expensive tastes. If Dan wants to keep helping them, that's his choice, but I refuse to be dragged into it anymore. Despite the drama, Dan and I are still friends. He's a good guy, albeit a bit blind when it comes to Susan and Greg. I hope this incident opened his eyes a bit, but only time will tell. For now, I'm standing my ground. If they want to eat like kings, they can pay like kings too. No more free rides on my watch. A few weeks later, another opportunity to demonstrate my point presented itself. It was Laura's birthday, and she had planned a weekend getaway to a cabin in the mountains. Everyone was excited, including Susan and Greg. I knew this was another chance for them to exploit the group's generosity, but I also saw it as an opportunity to reinforce my stance. We carpooled up to the cabin, and as soon as we arrived, the usual fun and games began. We unpacked, settled into our rooms, and gathered around the fireplace for some drinks and laughs. The first night went off without a hitch. We grilled burgers, shared stories, and played some board games. But by the second day, it was clear Susan and Greg were falling back into their old habits. We had planned a group grocery run to stock up for the weekend. Everyone chipped in a set amount to cover the basics: breakfast items, snacks, drinks, and supplies for a big barbecue we planned to have on our last night. As we shopped, I noticed Susan and Greg sneaking expensive items into the cart: premium steaks, imported cheeses, fancy chocolates, and top-shelf liquor. I decided to let it slide for the moment, but I made a mental note to address it later. Back at the cabin, everyone pitched in to prepare dinner. We cooked up a storm, and the meal was fantastic. But as the night wore on and the drinks flowed, Susan and Greg's contributions became apparent. They were the first to indulge in the premium items they had slipped into the cart, and they encouraged others to do the same. When the topic of splitting the grocery bill came up, they once again tried to spread the cost evenly among the group. I had anticipated this and had kept track of who contributed what. I pulled out my notes and pointed out that certain items were not agreed upon by everyone and should be covered by those who added them. Susan and Greg protested, claiming it was all part of the communal experience, but the rest of the group backed me up. They had had enough of the freeloading as well. The tension was palpable, but I remained firm. I insisted that those who wanted the premium items should cover their own costs. In the end, Susan and Greg reluctantly agreed, but their resentment was clear. The weekend continued with a bit of an edge, but I felt a sense of satisfaction knowing I had stood up for what was fair. On the drive back, Dan and I had a long conversation. He admitted that he had been blind to Susan and Greg's behavior for too long. He thanked me for opening his eyes and agreed that we needed to set boundaries to prevent future issues. It felt good to know that I had finally gotten through to him. A few months later, the group decided to take a trip to the amusement park. It was supposed to be a day of fun and laughter, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Susan and Greg would find a way to spoil it. Sure enough, as we made our way through the park, they gravitated towards the most expensive attractions and food stalls. When it was time for lunch, they suggested a fancy sit-down restaurant within the park, while the rest of us preferred the more affordable food trucks. I decided to call them out once more. I suggested we split up for lunch and meet back up afterward. The group agreed, and we all went our separate ways. Susan and Greg, predictably, went to the restaurant, while the rest of us enjoyed a variety of street food. When we reconvened, Susan and Greg tried to downplay their extravagant meal, but it was clear they had spent a small fortune. As the day wound down and we headed to the exit, Greg casually mentioned how expensive the tickets and food had been. He suggested we pool our remaining cash to cover some extra expenses. I stepped in and reminded him that everyone was responsible for their own costs. The rest of the group backed me up, and Greg had no choice but to drop the subject. Over time, our outings became less frequent, but the dynamics within the group shifted. Susan and Greg gradually started to change their behavior. They still had their moments, but they were more mindful of their actions. They realized that the group was no longer willing to tolerate their freeloading ways. Years passed, and our lives evolved. We moved from college students to working professionals, and our gatherings became more about quality time and less about extravagant spending. Susan and Greg's antics became a distant memory, and we all grew closer as friends. Looking back, I don't regret the stands I took. They were necessary to preserve the integrity of our friendships and ensure that everyone contributed their fair share. If it weren't for those tough moments, we might never have confronted the issues that threatened to tear us apart. And in the end, those confrontations led to growth, understanding, and stronger, more honest relationships. Even now, as we continue to gather for dinners, trips, and celebrations, the lessons learned from those days of splitting bills and calling out unfair behavior linger. We've all grown and changed, but the bonds we forged through those trials have endured. And for that, I'm grateful.